Hi. Today, I'd like to talk about Vietnamese, a language that, unfortunately, doesn't really seem to get the kind of attention I think it deserves. I mean, if you compare it to other Asian languages, things like Chinese, Japanese, or Korean, then in comparison, Vietnamese doesn't really seem to pull that much attention. And I think that's a big shame, because Vietnamese is also a really cool language. So today, I'd like to give a little introduction on Vietnamese pronunciation, a thing that a lot of people find quite difficult, but is also a pretty interesting topic on its own. And I think that comparing English pronunciation versus Vietnamese pronunciation gives us some really cool insights into the variance that's possible in human languages. Before we can talk about any of that, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about the video itself. I've decided to split it up into two parts, where in the first part I discuss the consonants, and in the second I talk about the vowels and the tones. Hopefully this makes the whole thing more digestible. The next thing I want to talk about is the goal and the target audience of the video. The goal of this video is to compare and contrast English and Vietnamese in a way that enriches your understanding of both languages and invites you to think about language more systematically. The target audience of this video are beginner-level Vietnamese language learners. So people who've been studying Vietnamese for maybe a few weeks and are looking for answers to some things that confuse them. I'll do my best to make everything as accessible as possible. Everything should still make sense even if this is your very first introduction to Vietnamese, but everything will be a lot easier to follow if you know at least a modicum of Vietnamese already. So, for example, if you know the meaning of all these words on screen, you've probably reached the level I'm trying to target. For the uninitiated, though, let's take a brief look at what makes Vietnamese so unusual. Take a look at the word on screen, Bat Dao. At first glance, there's a lot of scary stuff going on here. It's written as two separate words when it's actually a single word and concept. There's also a horizontal bar going through the D, which is a little strange. But scariest of all, there's letters here with multiple accent marks, and that kind of makes you wonder, what kind of information is being conveyed that requires two accent marks? We'll be answering these questions and more throughout the video, but first things first, let's talk about the consonants. The consonants in Vietnamese are ba, ba, ta, ta, da.
Whoa,
Ga,
hold on.
ga.
What are we looking at here?
Who said that?
I did. I'm you, except with an artificially lowered voice. I'll be acting as a sort of stand-in for the audience to ask you questions in their place.
Oh, okay. And what was your question?
I'm just confused by this thing you have on screen. Shouldn't we look at the alphabet or something first?
Good question. Let's talk about the alphabet then. So the alphabet is fine on its own, it's just that the letters are kind of arranged haphazardly, and so it's harder to see some of the connections between different sounds. For example, the D and T sounds, D and T, are really similar to each other, both in how they're produced and what they sound like, but they're far apart from each other on the alphabet, so it's harder to see this. Another problem with alphabets is that they don't give you much information about spelling conventions. So for example, there's nothing inherent in the alphabet that lets you know that TH makes a special sound, or CH, or SH. And this isn't a problem if you're learning a European language like German or Spanish or Italian or something, because a lot of these languages have a shared history with English, and so a lot of the spelling conventions in them exist in English as well. But in Vietnamese, which has its own literary history and its own spelling conventions, we need to really start from the ground up if we want to get it right. And that's where the chart comes in. The chart is designed to categorize all the sounds in Vietnamese in rows and columns according to certain features. I think for most people, it isn't actually obvious that it's even possible to categorize the sounds like this. I think people tend to think of the sounds as sort of disconnected islands that have no relation to each other. But actually, much like how you can categorize the elements according to a periodic table, you can do the same with the sounds used in speech. But before I talk about the layout of this chart, it might be better to start somewhere more familiar and talk about the chart of English sounds. Or actually, before I get into that, there's something else I need to address first. There's a writing system called the IPA, which is a standardized international alphabet which can tell you the pronunciation of any word in any language. It's super good at what it does, and in particular, it's really useful for describing the pronunciation of English words, because in English, you can't always trust the spelling to give you the correct pronunciation of a word. On screen here, I've written out 2 sentences using the IPA, and as you can see, its power comes at a price, which is that it's kinda hard to use. So in this video, we're not gonna use it, and instead, we'll just rely on Vietnamese's native writing system. Because, unlike English, Vietnamese actually has a really good writing system. Originally, I wanted to just leave these sentences on screen as a sort of exercise for you to try to parse on your own, but I think it's probably for the best if I read them out. The first line says, "Do squirrels know about the future or just act on instinct?" The second line says, "Khoa khơi là một ngoại quốc." Going back to the chart of English sounds, you'll notice that there's a few differences between this and the Vietnamese chart. The main difference being that the English chart seems a lot more compact and elegant than the Vietnamese one. That's because I actually simplified the chart, because we're not actually concerned with the finer details of English. Instead, we're talking about how linguists categorize the sounds, and I'm hoping that this simplified, familiar environment will be a good starting point for thinking more systematically about language. On the top row here, we have all of the stops in English. A stop is a sound characterized by a closure somewhere in the mouth, a buildup of pressure, and then a sudden release. This creates a loud but short-lived burst in volume. Pa, ba, ta, da, ka, ga. On the other hand, this row contains all the fricatives in English. A fricative is characterized by a constant yet turbulent stream of airflow. F, v, th, th, s, z, sh, zh, h. The horizontal rows categorize different manners of articulation, which are based on patterns in airflow and air pressure. The vertical columns, on the other hand, categorize different places of articulation, which have to do with the actual shape of the mouth. So, for example, all labial sounds are made with your lips pressed together. Pa, ba, ma, wa. On the other hand, all alveolar sounds are made with the tip of the tongue up near this structure behind the top front teeth, called the alveolar ridge. Ta, da, sa, za, na, la. Aside from manner of articulation and place of articulation, there are occasionally other features we want to watch out for, and in those cases, we try to slot them in as little subsections. And the most common example of this, and you can see it on the English chart here, is voicing. Voicing should be familiar to most of you, but it has to do with the vibration of your vocal folds, also known as vocal cords. It's hard to show on camera, but if you physically put your hand on your throat and then alternate between the S and Z sounds, you'll be able to feel it yourself. Now that we have a basic understanding, let's go back to the Vietnamese chart. One of the most immediately apparent quirks of Vietnamese is its strange writing conventions, and in particular, the letters V, R, D, and the digraph GI. If you look on the chart, you'll actually notice that each of those are on the chart twice in different colors. We'll talk about that a bit later, but for now, let's look at these 3 here. In this box, we have the letters R, D, and the digraph GI. And as you can see, they're in the voiced alveolar fricative box. That's the one that corresponds with the Z sound. And so this chart is telling us that the letters R, D, and the digraph GI make the Z sound. This is kind of hard for people to get used to because it's just so unusual. The reason behind it was that there were some major sound changes that occurred in the past, but the writing system never updated, so the spelling reflects the old pronunciation rather than the current one. For us as learners, this is something you just have to kind of get used to, but despite the weirdness of it, the writing system is actually fully phonetic, so it could be a lot worse. Another difference I'll point out is that Vietnamese has a couple sounds that aren't used in English. I've highlighted them all right now. None of these are too difficult, we'll just have to go into a little more detail once we get to them. On the flip side, there's also a couple sounds used in English which don't exist in Vietnamese. So for example, the TH sound as in think or there, and also the J sound as in judge. The last thing I want to comment on are these 3 sounds, ta, da, and da. These cause people a lot of trouble, and the culprit is a feature called aspiration. Aspiration is actually a really important part of both English and Vietnamese pronunciation, but it often goes ignored in English. It has to do with the actual amount of air used to produce a sound. If a sound is aspirated, then you use a lot of air, which comes out as an audible puff, while if a sound is unaspirated, then you use a very little amount of air, resulting in no audible puff. In English, the P, T, and K sounds will be aspirated if they occur at the very start of a syllable,
I'll be demonstrating with this toilet paper, but you can just use your hand and feel the air against your palm.
Pill, till, kill.
If these sounds come after an S, though, they then become unaspirated.
Spill, still, skill.
And just for good measure, I'll also let you know that the voiced counterparts of these sounds, B, D, and G, are always unaspirated.
Bill, dill, gill.
In English, we never really think much about aspiration because it comes and goes in this sort of deterministic, automatic process. But in order to speak Vietnamese, you're going to need to learn to control whether a sound is aspirated or not. So for practice, see if you can figure out how to say the Vietnamese words toi, doi, and doi. And now that we have all of that out of the way, I think we can start going through the chart properly now. So to begin, let's just run through the stops again real quick. We have ba, ta, da, ga, and ga. Now, I've already said everything I wanted to about the stops, so let's just move on. And on the next row here, we only have a single sound, the voiced post-alveolar tap, pronounced ra. Now, a tap is a lot like a stop, except it's shorter and much less impactful. Basically, the idea is to move your tongue in this sort of whipping fashion so that it reaches the roof of your mouth and cuts off airflow for the tiniest instant before coming back down. Now, if you look at the place of articulation for this sound, you'll notice it's in the post-alveolar column. That means that ultimately, you want to make contact with your tongue a little bit behind the alveolar ridge. For comparison, here's the English SH sound. And as you can see, the two sounds have very similar tongue positions, and while the Vietnamese R might be slightly further back, I think this gives you a really good starting point. Another thing I should mention about this sound is that there's actually two main ways to pronounce it. Some people make this sound with their tongue pointed forward, like this. That'll give you a ra sound, while others will actually curl their tongue backwards in a retroflex shape, and in extreme cases, that should sound something like ra. But either pronunciation, either the forward-facing ra or the retroflex ra, are both acceptable.
Pronouncing a tapped R is kind of difficult though. Do you have any tips on how to properly make this sound?
Yeah, I do. And tapped sounds aren't actually nearly as difficult as you may think. In fact, English has a sound that's quite similar to this one. Take the word Gouda, for example, which is a type of cheese. Now, you may not realize this, but the D in Gouda is not pronounced like a normal D. It falls between two vowels, and so is pronounced as a tapped ra sound instead. To illustrate what I mean, let's compare the pronunciation of the English word Gouda to the Spanish word segura.
One of the most popular cheeses in the world, Gouda.
¿Esperas? Estoy segura.
Gouda.
Segura.
Gouda.
Segura.
Gouda.
Segura.
Now, the examples I found come from different speakers in completely different contexts, but hopefully you can see the similarity. Moving back to the Vietnamese ra sound, if you're having trouble making it, then a good place to start would be to try to approximate it using the English ra sound, like we saw in the word Gouda. For practice, see if you can pronounce the Vietnamese words ra or roi using some manner of tap sound. Moving on, in the next row, we have an...
Aren't you going to explain why the chart has a blue R and a red R in different boxes?
Oh, right, thank you. So, Vietnam is a really big country, and because of that, there's a lot of different dialects of Vietnamese, but the ones that people care about the most are the Hanoi dialect in the north and the Saigon dialect in the south. Now, these two dialects are generally pretty similar, but they've been affected by different sound changes, and so I wanted to find a way to represent both dialects on a single chart. And to do that, I did color coding, where Saigon is represented by blue and Hanoi by red. So, returning to the chart, you'll see that the R here is blue, meaning it represents the pronunciation in Saigon only. On the next row here, we have a single affricate pronounced ch. And this sound is pronounced identically to the English CH sound, so there's not much to note there. The only thing worth mentioning is that there's two different ways of spelling this sound. And historically, the different spellings actually reflected two different sounds, but for most speakers, they've merged into a single sound. Moving on to the fricatives, we start with f and v. Both of these are easy to pronounce, so that shouldn't cause any issues. One thing I'd point out, though, is that the V is in red, meaning it only reflects the Hanoi pronunciation. Or, at least, that's mostly true. Here's the thing. In the north, the letter V always makes a V sound. This is normal, this is expected, nothing special is going on here. However, if you go to the south, you'll notice that the letter V makes the Y sound in every word except the word Viet. And this is pretty unusual because typically, when you have a sound change, it should apply consistently across the whole language. So having an exception like this is just kind of unexpected. So what happened? Well, basically, there's this phenomenon that sometimes happens where if there's a certain word or group of words that are culturally important enough, then the speakers of a language will actually preserve that word's pronunciation despite sound changes happening around it. You see this most often in sacred words, especially words for God or heaven, but seeing it here with the word Viet as a part of national identity also makes a lot of sense. For our next sounds, we have S and Z. These are pretty easy. They correspond exactly with the English S and Z sounds, respectively. The only thing to watch out for is the weird spelling, as well as the fact that the letters in this box are red, meaning they only reflect the pronunciation in Hanoi. For our next sound, we have sa, which doesn't exist in English, so it's gonna give us some trouble. Before we analyze this sound though, let's take a detour and talk about the English S sound and then SH sound. Here's a diagram of the S sound. As you can see, the tip of the tongue is just behind the teeth, while the blade of the tongue is right near the alveolar ridge. And here, we have the SH sound, where as you can see, the tongue is placed noticeably further back compared to the S sound. When we go to make the sh sound in Vietnamese, we want to take a sort of middle ground between these two, placing the blade of the tongue just behind the alveolar ridge. If you pause the video and take some time to practice, you should be able to teach yourself to say Vietnamese words like sao or song. If you find it too difficult though, you can just do what a lot of foreigners do and use the English SH sound as an approximation. It's less than ideal, but it does the job. Moving on, we have h and g. Neither of these sounds exist in English, but luckily they're not too difficult. They're both velar sounds, which means in order to form them, you're going to want to shape your mouth similarly to in the K and G sounds, where you have the back of your tongue up near this structure, called the soft palate. In the K and G sounds, your tongue will briefly make contact with the roof of your mouth, closing off airflow. But since the sounds we're trying to make are fricatives, we want to leave a small gap and allow air to pass through. Doing this correctly should give you the sound h and the voiced counterpart ga, as in the words he and ri. I couldn't think of any cool ways to approximate these sounds like I could with some of the others, but in terms of all the sounds you'd need to learn for Vietnamese, these ones are probably on the simpler end. If you absolutely had to, you could probably get by approximating them with the K and G sounds, but that shouldn't be necessary. Moving on to the last of the fricatives though, we have the H sound, ha, and this should be pretty easy because it's identical to the sound used in English. On the next row, we have our nasal sounds. These are sounds in which you block the air flowing out your mouth and instead direct it through your nose, which, when you think about it, is a little gross, but whatever. In any case, the first nasal sound is the nice and familiar M sound, ma, followed by the equally familiar N sound, na. The rest of the nasal sounds, though, are going to be a little bit more tricky. Let's start with this one here, nya. This sound isn't used in English, which always makes things kind of difficult, but it's not too bad. We can get to it pretty easily by comparing it to the English Y sound, so let's start there. The Y sound, as in the word yes, is produced by bringing the body of the tongue up near this part of the mouth, called the hard palate. By leaving a little bit of room for air to escape, you get the sound ya. What we want to do, though, is convert the ya sound into nya. And to do that, we need to bring the body of the tongue the rest of the way up, closing off airflow out the mouth, and then retract the velum, allowing air to escape through the nose. Overall, the process should be like making an N sound, except with your tongue placed here instead of here. This gives us nya, as in nyan or nya. Now, the process isn't really as easy as it sounds, and if you find yourself unable to make it correctly, then you can also just do what a lot of foreigners do and approximate this sound by making an N sound followed by a Y sound, like in the English word onion. Moving on, we have our last nasal sound, the velar nasal, nga. Now there's a lot to talk about with this sound. Firstly, it is used in English, so we're pretty lucky there. It appears in the word belong, for example. But we should still talk a little bit about its pronunciation, because you see, even though it's spelled NG, you actually don't want to make a G sound. This word should be pronounced belong, not belong. And likewise, this Vietnamese word should be pronounced chang, not chang. But that's the easy part, and I promised you that there'd be a lot to discuss, so let's move on to some more difficult words. On screen, we have the words ngan and ngu. For a lot of people, this kind of thing is really confusing because, how can you start a word on the NG sound? In English, and in most European languages, this kind of thing isn't allowed. But in Vietnamese, it's perfectly fine. And so, to get used to the way Vietnamese handles it, we're gonna have to do a little bit of rewiring. And to do that, let's start by looking at an English phrase like hang on. And what we want to do is say the phrase out loud, but see if we can redraw the boundaries a little bit so that hang on becomes hey ngon. And hopefully, this kind of exercise will help you conceptualize other words that start with this sound, like ngu, ngan, or ngop. Now, another special thing about this sound is that it actually has a palatalized variant, nga, used, for example, in the words nyi and nye. You see, there was an old sound change involving the vowel sounds e and e, where if you had a word that started on the ng sound and moved on to either vowel, then the vowel would actually slightly alter the pronunciation of the ng sound, turning nga to nya. And to reflect the altered pronunciation, we add an h. In order to understand how this sound change occurred, though, we're going to need to discuss how the sounds involved are formed. On screen, I've put a diagram of the NG sound, and as you can see, much like in the sounds h and g, in this sound, we have the back of the tongue constricting airflow at the soft palate. Where I want you to direct your attention, though, is to the front part of the tongue, because it's kind of just hanging around and not doing anything. And now, let's take a look at the vowel sound E as used in the word nyi. And as you can see, the mouth shape for this sound is quite different, where we have the tongue placed further forward, creating this tiny gap for air to squeeze through, right under the hard palate. And with this in mind, let's consider the word ngi again, because originally, before the sound change, this word just consisted of the ng sound followed by the e vowel. And what can really easily happen in a word like this is that as you're making the ng sound, you're anticipating where your tongue is going to need to be for the e vowel. And so you prematurely move the tip of your tongue in place for that sound. Doing this will give the ng sound a palatal component, making it sound like nya instead of nga. Now, this whole process is pretty interesting, and it's a really good example of how sound change works, but the new sound produced from it is barely even any different from the original. In fact, if it weren't reflected in spelling, I doubt very many people would even realize that there's two different sounds going on here. But in any case, at least now you know what's going on with the two variants. If you want, you can practice pronouncing them differently, but to be honest, the difference is so subtle that you could probably get away with just pronouncing them identically to each other, and no one will ever really notice. And with all of that finally covered, we're ready to move on to the next section, the approximants. The approximants are sounds that allow air to pass through your mouth relatively unhindered, and because of that, they really skirt the line between consonant and vowel. And our first approximant is the W sound, W. Now, a lot of people would actually say that Vietnamese doesn't have a W sound, and the official alphabet actually lacks the letter W. Instead, in Vietnamese, whenever you want to represent a W sound, you usually just approximate it using the next closest thing, which would be the vowel O or U. That said, though, the W sound as a consonant, represented with the letter W, does occasionally appear in loanwords, so I've decided to include it as a sort of honorary member. So here you have it. The next sound after that is the L sound, la. Now, the L sound is technically not an approximant, but I wanted the chart to be more compact, so I put it here. The Vietnamese L sound is identical to the English sound though, so there's not really much to discuss here anyway. And now, last but not least, we have the Y sound, ya, which is closely linked to the E vowel. And while the sound is easy to make on its own, I should point out the weird spelling, because in Vietnamese, this sound is represented with the letters V, D, or the digraph GI. I should also mention that these letters are all blue, meaning they only make this sound in Saigon. And with that, we've covered all the consonants in Vietnamese. Before we're ready to move on to the next section though, I want to talk a little bit about syllable structure. Linguists separate the syllable into three parts. The onset, where you can put one or more consonants at the start of the syllable, the nucleus, which should have one or more vowels, and the coda, where you can end the syllable with one or more consonants. When it comes to consonants, English tends to be pretty open-minded. You can find words with lots of consonants in a row, and likewise, you can also find words that have no consonants at all. Vietnamese, on the other hand, can sometimes feel a lot more restrictive, because it only allows a maximum of one consonant in the onset and one consonant in the coda. And furthermore, the consonant used in the coda has to come from this group. And this group is the last thing we need to cover before we're done with the consonants. So let's take a look at it. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is this feature here, which says no audible release. Typically, a stop sound is based on the idea of a stoppage of airflow, a buildup of pressure, and then a sudden release. But with these sounds, you actually want to stop the airflow and then just halt the sound there. So if we're trying to say this word on screen, for example, we want to pronounce it Viet, not something like Viet. You want that T sound to barely even register. The next thing I want to point out is the weird spelling here. If you see a CH at the end of the word, it's pronounced like a K sound, and this is probably the result of some sound change somewhere. Which also means, unfortunately, that the word on screen here, which means turquoise, is actually pronounced beak. Finally, there's something weird going on with the velar sounds. You see, one thing that can be really confusing for newcomers is the pronunciation of Vietnamese words like loop or không. In the case of loop, for example, it's spelled with a C at the end, which would indicate a K sound, but in practice, it's pronounced loop with what sounds like a P at the end. Likewise, the word không sounds like it ends with an M sound, so what's going on here? Well, these words were affected by a sound change involving the vowel sounds O and U. And these vowels are special because in order to form them, you have to purse your lips together as if you're giving a kiss. And this means that your lips are very close together when making these sounds. And so what would happen is that as people were saying words like không, for example, they'd round their lips for the vowel, but then, in anticipation of the end of the word, they would inadvertently close their mouths the rest of the way too early, and this would change the nga sound into a ma sound. Likewise, in words like loop, for example, a similar process changed the k sound into a b sound. And with that, we've gone through all the information I wanted to cover on the consonants. But before I end this video, I want to talk about one more thing. I'm a really big advocate of flashcards, so if you're a beginner, I'd recommend you stop here and make a flashcard set. It'll be more special if you make it yourself, on the sounds used in Vietnamese and what letters or letter combinations represent them. As a review, here we have our quote-unquote friendly letters who make more or less the same sound in both English and Vietnamese. Here, we have our less friendly letters, who still make sense, but maybe are slightly different between English and Vietnamese. And finally, here we have our special snowflakes, who really don't make much sense at all. And now, we've reached the end of the video, so thank you for watching, I wish you good luck in your studies, and I hope you'll come back for part 2 to learn about the vowels and the tones. Thank you.